I want to welcome folks back to our 7th interview that we're doing with staff members of the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center. And today, my guest is Kathryn, and I forgot to ask you the correct pronunciation of your last name, so I'm going to just jump right in. Well, you do it. What's the correct pronunciation of your last name?
I believe it's Ballingall.
So phonetically, like it's spelled.
Yes.
Okay. And we're doing this in conjunction with the upcoming Maine town meeting, and which will be held on June 1st. And our speaker will be Jonathan Rubin, who's the director of the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center. And I will include a link with this post about how you can register to participate. Kathryn, how long have you worked for the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center?
Almost 4 years now. Yeah, started in 2018.
And what was your attraction to the Policy Center?
Well, I found myself drawn to Maine for someone else's career, actually. So I ended up in Maine. I was an urban transportation researcher focusing on cycling infrastructure. So it was a little bit of a switch in terms of, practice area, but I have found it very fruitful to be learning about Maine's transportation and just Maine in general. So, yeah.
So what sort of projects do you work on for the Policy Center?
Right. So I have a background in civil engineering, and I specialized in my master's at looking at, how do people make choices about where they bike, and what impacts do bike lanes or sort of safer intersections make on people's travel choices. And so essentially what I do is work a lot with data about transportation, about how people move to try to help make decisions, most notably policy decisions around infrastructure or programs, understanding the impacts of transportation, like is there a lot of congestion or air quality concerns? So a lot of that information, like if we want to do a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, it's useful to know where people are driving or how much they're driving. So having this kind of sense about travel pattern and choices is sort of my focus. And that's been, I would say, 80% of my work at the center so far. And it's been great. It's been wonderful.
And are like specific projects that you're currently working on in that realm of infrastructure?
Yeah, so I would say in the last few years, I've been doing a lot of work with a data set that the state of Maine has purchased. It's called Streetlight, and it's not streetlights. It's actually based on third-party location data. And what they can do is infer, basically they can tell governments and states and consultants, they can give them an estimate of the traffic flows at any given time. So kind of how Google knows that, the traffic is congested or not. It's not as sophisticated, but it is in terms of our transportation research world. And it's proven to be quite useful during the pandemic to look at the changes in travel. And what's interesting is we can look at not just the change of vehicles on the I-95, but understanding, are these visitors coming from Massachusetts or whatnot? So you can kind of understand generally where they're coming from and generally where they're going to. It's all anonymized, I should mention, and very, very strictly private, but it's been really useful to look at, I think, the economic impact of tourism and how that's changed. Another really interesting project was, instead of just looking at vehicles, we looked at trail use across southern Maine. And we found that cycling increased a little bit, but not that much. And my hypothesis is that most cycling that happens is in the Portland area. And so when a lot of folks worked from home, a lot of those bike commuters stopped biking as much and maybe just went on trails recreationally. So we saw this increase in recreational cycling and a decrease in commuting. But pedestrian usage doubled. It increased in 2020 and it kept going again. And so I think that's sort of highlighting the importance of outdoor recreation and its popularity. And it's also, making the case that there's growing demand for these outdoor recreation facilities, these trails and state parks, but in other locations as well. And they merit investment.
Yeah. Well, as an avid hiker, I can attest to that. In the first year of the pandemic, 2020, we'd get to these very remote spots and think, oh, there'd be no problem parking. And you'd find the parking lot's already full. So yeah, there were a lot of people out there hiking during the pandemic.
One of the fun case studies that I had was we looked at Camden State Park and every trail segment. And I wanted to understand, how is this data sensitive enough to tell us like what trails are used or not? So that if you have a fixed, capital plan or capital improvement budget, you can focus on the trails that need it the most. And something that was really funny is that there's a lot of trails beyond Mount McGuntacook and Mount Batty. So when you go more inside the park, further afield or more remote trailheads, in 2019, which is our benchmark year, there weren't many people using those trails, but in 2020, it really increased.
That's interesting.
And I can imagine, like if you're nervous about encountering other people on the trail when you don't know much about how COVID's being transmitted, you could see that people were going to remote areas, at least within the park, but I'm sure that happened all over the state, where I remember going to places that I'd never walked before. But then it reduced in 2021. So that's kind of interesting. We're more comfortable with the pandemic and walking outside. And so we were happy to go back to our popular trails.
So one of the questions I've been asking everyone, we started doing this, and I think you're the 62nd person we've interviewed since the pandemic started. And because in those early days, the pandemic was on everyone's mind, we would ask them how it was changing the research or their work. And you've already hinted at, just in trail usage and cycling. But going back to traffic patterns, what did you find? What was the effect of the pandemic?
What we found was that travel, I would say from mid-March, so just when schools were
2020.
Of 2020, yeah, like just at the beginning when schools were starting to close or things in New York were looking a little bit more dire, people were naturally reducing their driving. And the lowest point, I think, was at the end of March. And then very slowly and consistently, travel increased. And I would say that it was maybe back to within maybe 10 to 20%, or 10 to 20% less than typical by the end of the summer. So still low, but most of the traffic rebounded, I would say, by then. And yeah, no, it was interesting. I remember being asked by the Portland Press Herald, they were saying, oh, there's all of these data, that's being used from lots of different sources that are used to sort of see what areas are being compliant with stay at home. So like what areas are reducing their travel more than they typically do. And I guess the assumption was that, okay, everybody's supposed to stay from home. And so if they're breaking the stay-at-home orders, they're going to be driving around a lot. And what we found was that rural areas didn't drop as much as urban areas. And I wanted to provide a more nuanced approach to that, because they were saying, oh, like Aroostook County gets a D and Cumberland gets a B, and I was like, we can't make that comparison, in part because of travel patterns, right? So if you have a job as an essential worker, or you have to travel from work, you can't work remotely, then you're going to continue doing your work trips. But commuting is only a third of the amount of trips we make in a day. And so if you're used to going to the movies, going to like your kids' activities, or, just driving around to your friends or to the restaurant, and you're out and about in the city and traveling a lot, whereas in rural areas, anecdotally, you're not going to necessarily go out 5 times a day if, trips or places are quite far from you. And so we were just trying to provide some more perspective on that kind of assessment and that's something that we're focusing a lot more on at the center now is looking at rural travel behavior. It's very much understudied in the literature. And we're actually going to start a survey looking in the Penobscot and Piscataquis counties and trying to understand travel needs in that area, in those 2 counties, but also understanding how COVID has changed that. And there's also been some new mills opening up, and so jobs and everything are sort of, I think that the pandemic has caused all sorts of effects on transportation. Like there was a shortage of new vehicles, used vehicles were very expensive. Now gas is going up. And so I think there's been so much changing very quickly, and changing beyond what we would have thought normally could be possible. Like if you had asked me a year or two ago if gas would go up to almost $5 a gallon, I would have balked, but there we are.
Mhm.
So.
So from what you were saying, do you think the volume of traffic is back to normal or even exceeding what it was prior to March of 2020, or is there still room for recovery there?
I actually haven't looked beyond 2021. I haven't looked at this year's data. But I would say that it's pretty much back to normal. Yeah.
But within that, with the quantity maybe back to normal, or even at this point above where it was in March of 2020, do you think the patterns have changed? Patterns of travel?
That's a good question. And I think that requires more research, right? I think looking at what happens this summer, where pretty much we're all living with COVID now, right? And I think that it'd be interesting to kind of track that multi-year, because it never officially ended, right? It was never officially like, okay, now we're back to normal.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm curious. I do think that more research is needed to understand the shift in tourism and understanding what we were interested in understanding was, and this is what we found, is that the tourism in the fall of 2020 came back much faster from New Hampshire and Massachusetts. So the local tourists, so people were coming to Maine to hike, and they were doing that much more than folks from Texas were coming. So I'm curious to see if folks that were, there's a lot of people who come to Acadia from all over the country to go and see the Acadia in the fall. And I'm curious if people who had put off that trip in 2020 and maybe even 2021, are they rebounding? So are we going to have these sort of increased waves of trips, or are people just going to go to the beach? I don't know.
Yeah. I've been spending a lot of time in Acadia this spring, and I think I remember that it was a record-breaking season last summer at Acadia National Park. And just anecdotally, walking around, hiking this past Saturday, license plates from all over the country. And you said Texas. I distinctly remember seeing 2 cars pass me by with Texas plates, and not just Texas, license plates from all over the country.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. So trail usage, tourism. I have here in my notes, and this may have come up in a staff meeting. Are you working on a COVID report?
I'm working. No, I don't think so.
Okay. Somehow that got into my notes here.
It might be the COVID issue of our.
Oh, okay.
Review.
Are you doing something for that COVID issue?
No.
Okay.
I should probably, but.
So another question I've been asking staff members, but it's a policy center. In doing your work, do you think about public policy? Do you think about specific policies, or how do you situate yourself within that idea that this is a policy center?
I think that my approach has been, my career kind of evolution has sort of situated me, and I think a lot of engineers are like this, we like numbers and science and data, but I think a lot of engineers want to make the world better, and they want to use their knowledge about how to build things, to make the world better, however you want to define that. I guess that's the policy question. And I've always thought that I could bring my skills of understanding data to the decision-making process. So I would say that's what I'm keen to do, is I'm keen to identify information so that we can make smarter policies. And that small little piece of the pie of the whole policy world is something that I quite enjoy. And so, yeah, we do work looking at the greenhouse gas impacts of travel. and trying to understand, for example, with Maine's vehicle fleet. So everybody's cars that are driving, is our vehicle fleet older than the rest of the country? And what would it mean if Mainers started driving electric vehicles? How would that impact our greenhouse gas plan, the Maine Climate Action Plan? And so, yeah, I would say, you could say that looking at reducing greenhouse gases is a particular policy. And so we do try to provide some good, accurate, non-biased information.
Data is a theme that's come up with a lot of the people that I've interviewed. And big data is a term that's thrown around a lot today. What are your feelings about big data? I mean, in terms of this transportation study you were doing, that's what you're doing. You're just like grabbing a lot of data and trying to extract information from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's overall probably, or I think it is a really useful tool. And I think big data, it can be defined different ways, but I would say with this streetlight data set, that is big data, right? It's a lot of information about a lot of trips in a large area and a large timeline. I guess like big data, I would consider something that's consistently measured over time. And that's what makes it so big, right? It's not just a snapshot, but it is kind of continuum. And that ability to look at the continuum and the trends, like that means a lot more. Sometimes being able to do a before and after than just one slice. Yeah, and I was just talking with a friend about travel modeling, for example, and we engineers have borrowed a lot of modeling from the economics discipline in terms of trying to understand choice. So if I could bike to work or walk to work, which one would I choose? And so there's lots of different statistical models that you can use, and you use large data sets to sort of make those estimates or those models. But they're always approximations. So I think that idea that there is a bit of a limit, or we have to understand that a model is very much just that. It's not the reality. And it's important to go beyond just the data, to complement that with having conversations with people and doing more social science work as well. It's all complementary.
But another piece of it is that the more data you have, the better models you can create. So why did you decide to become an engineer?
I think maybe a couple of reasons. One is my grandfather was a mechanical engineer, and I don't know, I guess it was encouraged. But also I just really liked my math and science classes. I always thought they were fun. I liked all of my classes. I remember, I think it was my mom who told me I was interested in architecture. And she said, architects sleep underneath their desks. It's going to be a lot of work. And I thought, oh gosh, no. So I don't know. How do we make decisions about where we end up and what we study and what we end up doing? I would say that's, it's been a bit of a winding path.
So there's lots of different types of engineers you can be. You mentioned your grandfather was a mechanical engineer. Why did you decide to become a civil engineer?
I think I really liked cities. I think I was very interested at the time in green building and designing homes and buildings that were passive and used the sun to heat themselves and things like that. So yeah, that's what drew me initially.
So this has been surprising. It probably shouldn't be, but as I've interviewed each person, it's become very clear how their disciplinary backgrounds shapes their approach to their projects. So I've interviewed a historian, an anthropologist, an economist, and now I have an engineer. So what does engineering, that discipline, what does it bring to your approach to projects?
Yeah, I think it brings, I don't know, that kind of, it's hard for me to compare, but I think that I have beyond just an interest in the data, I think what I've learned about engineering is this kind of perseverance in terms of problem solving. And so if I'm doing a lot of analysis and I'm getting stuck, it's this idea of persevering through that and working through it. And yeah, I think what I've learned through my career, at least in terms of sort of beyond school, but working in sort of engineering type environments, what I've learned is that you have to complement that with a more design thinking. So you really have to think about the context within which you're getting data and what you're trying to express. And so that's been something that I think engineering communications thinks a lot about, and visual data communications. Those are components that are maybe not traditionally engineering, but those have really informed how I approach my work and the value that I see in the work we do.
Mm-hmm. You said something earlier about this idea with engineering that in some ways you're trying to fix the world or engineer the world. Is that at all part of your approach to these projects?
No, I would say I think there was a moment where I really did not identify with that. I thought there was hubris associated with that. And it's true. There's very valid critiques of, top-down planning. I think engineers maybe unfairly get wrapped up in that. But, if you look at the decision to build dams or highways in certain areas that have economic, environmental impacts, maybe traditionally that wasn't really thought of, or the engineers maybe said, okay, well, that's not my decision, or that's not my discipline. That's up to the politicians or the bureaucrats to make those decisions. And I think nowadays there is more of a sense, at least I remember from my undergrad, there was more of a sense that no, we have the technical knowledge. We should be thinking of the economic and social and environmental impacts of our work from the get-go. And so those perspectives have been more integrated in our discipline.
So with your official biography on the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center website, it also mentions, as part of your research interests, autonomous vehicles. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so it was actually my first project at the center, and we were trying to understand, what do we need to do in the state of Maine to prepare for these connected and autonomous vehicle technologies? Like, do we need to build our bridges differently if they're going to be self-driving trucks going across bridges? Like, does that change the load on the bridge? And so there were a lot of questions about the infrastructural needs. Like, are we going to have to change the way we paint the lines on the road and things like that? And I think what we found, or the conclusion of my research, was that a lot of these technologies are going to be relying on communications technology, and they need to be powered. And so we don't really know yet what street designs are going to be required, but we are pretty sure they're going to require an internet connection or a cell connection to communicate and to gather information. And so that's going to be, I think, a challenge, but that's something that I think has been talked about a lot in Maine, about expanding broadband access to rural areas. And I think also building out an electric charging network is going to require, an electric vehicle charging network, that's going to require broadband, or at least an internet connection, and power. So it's kind of interesting to think about how this new technology, which is still quite vague, it's not quite clear when it will come out, but it's going to require supportive infrastructure to make it happen.
So behind these concepts that we hear about, like electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, there's a lot of infrastructure behind that will need to go in before those things are viable.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the electric vehicle infrastructure, where we know what we need, we know what the demand is, and so it's much further along. Autonomous vehicles, it's still uncertain. How exactly is an autonomous vehicle going to drive at night in a snowstorm in Maine, and do that safely on its own? Does it require a digital GPS map of the road? What happens if something happens to the road? These are questions that I think, when you think about, Silicon Valley and driving a little car around Silicon Valley, that's fine. But I think, thinking about the realities here in Maine, it's quite different. I was recently in a blizzard and I thought there is no way that a car could do a better job than I can, like driving through this, because at least, I don't know, unless it had like X-ray vision or something.
Well, my guess is that where we'll first see it in Maine is, you mentioned trucking. But yeah, you can run a truck autonomously out in the desert, but how do you run it in Maine in the wintertime? To be determined. We'll see what the future holds. So something else I want to pursue. It sounds like you have a keen interest in cycling. Is that true?
Yes, yeah, that's true.
Are you a cycler?
Yeah, I used to ride my bike everywhere.
Okay, so more than even recreationally, you made it part of your transportation habit.
Yeah, it was my main transportation mode. When I lived in an urban center and I didn't have a child, but that kind of changes things. Yeah, I have a 4-year-old son, and I think I'm a little bit too nervous to ride my bike with him on the roads, let's say, to go to work.
But do you continue to bike recreationally?
I do. And I wish there were more facilities in our area around Bangor.
What do you need?
I think recreationally, it'd be really nice to see more contiguous trails. There aren't many bike or multi-use paths in our area. And I think in other parts of Maine, they're making an effort to build that out, especially along old rail lines, rail trails.
Yeah,
they're quite popular. I keep dreaming. I know that it's a functional rail line, but I keep wishing that the rail line that goes through downtown Bangor up to Orono into Old Town along the river. I keep wishing that they would make that a path. It'd be beautiful.
Yeah. Well, they're going to convert one here in the Skowhegan area, which I think is like a 30-mile stretch, maybe from Waterville, even south of Waterville, up to like Anson and Emden. And so people are excited about that. Add 30 more miles of multi-use trail. You mentioned you think like Portland has a good bicycling infrastructure, but it sounds like maybe Bangor isn't there yet.
I don't think so.
Are there any groups working on it?
Sorry?
Are there any groups working on it?
I haven't been that involved. So I won't say that they haven't if they have been. I know that there's been efforts to make cycling safer. There's cycling and pedestrian infrastructure safer in Bangor, especially for less abled folks. But yeah, I would like to see more infrastructure. I know we do have a river walk along in Brewer. I think it's maybe a mile long. And so it's not really bikeable just because you could do it in 3 minutes. But in terms of pedestrian infrastructure, it's great. There's tons of people who walk along there. Yeah. There are restaurants along the river. And I think that what people are finding in most areas is that they're maybe not too enthusiastic or they don't really care about a new trail coming in. But once it's there, everybody flocks to it. I hear that story over and over again.
Interesting.
You know, people are like, why are we doing all this work to put in a trail? And then you use it and you're like, oh, this is great. So yeah, I agree that we need more trails.
What about the university? What's their bicycle infrastructure like? I know they have some trails. Are they multi-use?
Yeah, there's a multi-use trail that goes to Old Town into campus. And I see lots of cyclists in Orono crossing the bridge to go into Marsh Island. So I think there's a very good infrastructure there. And I think also it's not just the bike lane or the street pavement quality, although that really matters. It's also the vehicle speed and also awareness of bikes. And are people, you know, making sure that there's a meter separation, or are they just going to whiz by? And I think it's, at least that was, you know, and that's the perception of safety. And I think that that's something that could be worked on too, is making a bike culture, or at least, you know, having peace between the drivers and the cyclists. So, yeah.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your time and talking with me today about the work that you do at the Policy Center. And again, this series is in conjunction with our Maine Town meeting, which will be held on June 1st. And the speaker will be the director, Jonathan Rubin, who I think you do a lot of work with, because Jonathan also has an interest in transportation.
That's right. Yeah.
So again, thank you very much for your participation.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.